It's interesting for us, especially Iranians, to look back almost 30 years and realize how much has changed since then. We try to bring at least a couple of signs from a student movement back there, and it's just a reminder of the days of 60s and 70s of Iranian students in US, which were quite a lot of them actually. On this campus, at some point there were about 700 Iranian students enrolled. And Iranian student population usually was a large quantity of active students, and mostly political in a sense. I was a student at that time in Iran, and quite bizarrely, I was classmate of President Ahmadinejad at Tehran University of Science and Technology. We both graduated civil engineering, and then the story of Islamic Revolution was such that people at the same desk were divided, and the society became so polarized that we never saw each other. And some of my colleagues and my classmates actually saw their classmate as torturers and interrogators in Iranian prisons after the revolution. From my class, I do remember quite a few who were executed. There was a closure of universities a couple days after the revolution on the pretext of the Cultural Revolution. They closed down all the universities. And some of my classmates, I was actually at the last semester before I graduated. And so some of us were allowed to go back and finish the school before school was closed finally. And then 2 years later, when they reopened the university, some of our classmates had disappeared, obviously to torture chambers, to executions, and so on and so forth. But the story of Islamic Revolution is not a personal story of revenge. An example of that is basically what happened in the course of early years of Islamic Revolution with regards to American diplomats and other staff in the embassy, the Marines, the translators, whoever was working in the embassy. 52 of them were taken hostage for about 444 days. The story of October surprise is still untold. There are writing about it everywhere, including my dear friend Gary Sick has written about it. But there is really no documentation to that effect, that there was a negotiation between the Republican Party. At the time, it was a Ronald Reagan campaign against President Carter. And I asked, again, another dear friend, John Limbert, who was at the time one of the 52 hostages in the embassy. And he kind of, in a not clear word, I interviewed him actually a couple of weeks ago on cable, and he's indicated that this is what is being believed, and the hostages could have been released at least 2 months earlier, and not being prolonged to January, right after the exact date of President Reagan's inauguration. They were handed over in Algiers to Algerian government, and then they were transferred to US. A guest of our forum today is Mr. Precht. Henry Precht was a diplomat and entered foreign service in 1961. And he served in Iran in the 70s, early 70s. He also served as Palestine Arab desk in the State Department. But most importantly, he was one of the three, I would call, point persons during the Islamic Revolution in the Washington administration. Very similarly to what we saw in the past 8 years, there was a lot of competition and a lot of, disagreement between three channels of administration, intelligence or information services, so to speak. The State Department, the point person was Mr. Pratt. The Defense Department, under Harold Brown, they dispatched General Heuser, Robert Heuser, who was a deputy commander of NATO, to Tehran. And then there was National Security Council under Dr. Brzezinski, and the contact person or the point person was Gary Sick, in charge of Iran. Each would get their information from their own channel from Tehran. Obviously, the State Department was supposedly be the closest and the most accurate information because it was coming right from Tehran, from the embassy. Ambassador Sullivan was in contact with Mr. Precht, I suppose daily. He will narrate that story. Robert Heuser was sent to Tehran for like 4 or 5 weeks before Shah's exit from Tehran. But in his absence, there was General Gast, who was the commander of American advisory to the military in Iran. And the information channel to National Security Council, ironically, was the Iranian ambassador to Washington, D.C., Mr. Ardashir Zahedi, who had very good friendship with Dr. Brzezinski. And so each one of these three channels had their own bias against what was happening in Iran. And in fact, at some point, President Carter wrote down on his memoir that sometimes I'm surprised that I get these three information or three reports from Tehran from the same city that these reports are coming from. And so for us, 30 years later, it's not a surprise. What happened with Iraq was similarly conflicts of information and intelligence. And so when we were discussing and having an event in commemoration of Islamic Revolution here in Portland, when I talked with Jennifer and Maria Wolf from World Affairs Council, we graciously sponsored this event. And Middle East Studies Center, my another dear friend, Dr. Gene Campbell, I was a little bit concerned. What do we want to call this? Is it a celebration of 30th anniversary of Islamic Revolution? Is it a condemnation of Islamic Republic? Or what do we want to call it? But the reality is the history has some place in our lifetime. And going back and looking at it from a critical perspective, I assume would be at least a scholarly work to do. And for this institution to host that event is very appropriate. And for me, it's really an honor to invite Mr. Precht, who I first face-to-face meeting was this morning, but I have had email communication with him and other colleagues of him from that era through a mailing group called Gulf 2000. Mr. Charlie Noss, who at that time was in the embassy in Tehran, and again, John Limbert and Gary Sick, I have asked them questions and inquired in the past about the course of history, and one of the reasons that made me really interested in that was a small book came out about a year and a half ago, written by David Barsamian. He's a producer of alternative radio, and in that book, he quoted Noam Chomsky, saying that President Carter sent a general didn't give the name, sent a general to Tehran to stage a coup. To me, as a person who was on the other side of the borders in Tehran, we thought at that time, or what we were reading in papers, was that he was there to prevent a coup d'etat. This obviously goes for the first 5 weeks that he spent in Tehran, and it was really shortly prior to Shah's leaving the country and the final victorious days of the revolution. But now there are some, I guess, statements by others that, in fact, there was some instruction to examine the possibility of a coup, which, in a sense, was also behind the hostage takeover in the embassy. Again, for somebody who was in Iran at that time and an active student, and I do remember that really in front of the embassy it turned into a circus, because everybody would go there. There was food stands and people were standing singing songs until in the morning. Then they would do the morning prayers in front of the embassy entrance. And so it was a populist action, but in the mind of many people was to prevent a coup. They thought that meeting between Dr. Brzezinski and Prime Minister Bazargan was a pre-arrangement for a return of the Shah. And with that history of 1953, which we don't want to talk about it anymore, the fact is that these were all in the mind of the people and those students, which many of them today are very reformed and change-minded people, and there are many examples of them. So with that said, just to give you a Iranian side perspective of what happened 30 years ago, we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of Islamic Revolution, and it's very appropriate to have Henry Precht, who was the person whose name would come up all the time in articles. And in fact, Dr. Saimi, this morning when I picked him up at the airport, he said, well, 30 years ago I was an active opposition student, and 30 years later now I'm going to speak with Henry Precht, which I heard the name back then as somebody who was trying to prevent Shah from leaving and all of that. So with that, at least we can celebrate this, this friendship. Mr. Precht.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizations who invited me here. This is the first time in my life I've been in Portland. What a wasted life. I'm going to do several things. I'm going first to start with a commercial, and then I'm going to offer an excuse, and then I will offer some inexcusable but sweeping generalizations about the days of Iran where I had something really to do about it. First, the commercial. You will find in the back of the room this marvelous volume of short stories illustrating what a Foreign Service officer does and what the problems are in the Middle East. You don't have to read it. There's wonderful blurbs, though, and a wonderful illustration. You can just put it on your coffee table and it will impress your guests. But it's the illustration that I want to talk about. This is a primitive Iranian painting that shows the hero of the Shahnameh, that great Iranian epic, killing the great Div, symbol of evil. In the background, you will see a small Div, lesser evil, tied to a tree. Now why? What explains this? Rustam rather resembles a Foreign Service officer, wouldn't you think? Rustam didn't trust the little white Div. He thought he might change sides. The little white Div had guided Rustam to the cave of the great white Div. Rustam thought, the little white Div will stab me in the back. So he tied him up. The message is the message that you need to understand in order to understand the Middle East. Distrust. Distrust on all sides. That is the basic problem. Well, I don't think I need to say anything more. That's the lesson for today. Actually, for those of you who love alliteration, I will give you 4 points that will help you to understand what went wrong with the American side. Same things went wrong on the Iranian side, but I'm not in a position to develop that. The 4 points that I would cite all begin with the letter I. Ignorance, ideology, inertia, and insults. Ignorance of Iranian history and current politics, ideology of the Cold War kind and the pro-Shah kind. Inertia, the kind of thing that State Department guys do every day. They come into office, they did what they did yesterday. Very hard to change policy under those conditions. And insults, not only direct insults, but when you praise your one side's opponents, the other side feels insulted. Bear those in mind as I go through this tale. Also dealing with the letter I, that is I, Henry Precht, because it'll be very personal. But first I want to say something about Iran, and I probably will offend all of the Iranians who are here. In my view, there are 4 components of the Iranian character, individual and national. They are pride, nationalism, insecurity, and pragmatism. Bear those in mind when you're trying to analyze any problem, seek any kind of solution with Iran. How do these 4 qualities, or how are they affected? All right, now into the chronology. I was assigned to Iran in 1972 with very little background about the country. So I stopped, I had a few days in Washington to inform myself before I went out. And I asked the desk officer if he could recommend a book I could read on current Iranian politics. He said, there is none. Now, he was wrong on 2 counts. On the first count, he was wrong because there was a book on it, not as many as there are today, but there was a book, a classic by Richard Kadam called Nationalism in Iran. But Richard Kadam had befriended many Iranian students who were opposed to the Shah, and the State Department would have nothing to do with him because he was regarded by the Shah's people as an enemy of the regime. He was wrong on another count in that there were politics in Iran. There were politics at home, in the mosques, and in the universities, but not the kind of politics that Americans recognize. Now, so much for ignorance and ideology. Now let's move to the end of the revolutionary period, when the whole structure was collapsing. Dr. Brzezinski, who had a very strong ideological commitment to anti-Soviet policies and regarded Iran as a necessary piece of the wall of containment surrounding the Soviet Union, and subscribed to complete American support for the Shah no matter what. On the last day of the revolution, February the 11th, when units of the Iranian military rose up against their commanders and a battle ensued in South Tehran, word reached Washington. Dr. Brzezinski telephoned Ambassador Sullivan and said, now is the time for General Gast, who was the chief of our military mission, to tell the chief Iranian general to stage a coup. Ambassador Sullivan said to Brzezinski, you must be speaking Polish. I can't understand you. He said, General Gast is in the basement of the commander's building. He can't get out. He can't tell anyone anything. He's trying to save his own life. And so the revolution succeeded, and we failed. Now, to move back from that ideological high point. Let me go back to when I came out of Iran, 4 years after I went there. There was a new desk officer on Iran, Charlie Nass. Charlie said to me, "How are things going out there?" And I thought, what's this? No State Department officer has ever inquired as to the stability and permanence of the Shah's regime. What is Charlie up to here? So I said to him, things are not very good economically. There was an oil boom, leveled off. A lot of people lost their jobs, inflation. The country is under considerable stress. They don't have any economists who were able to manage this sort of thing. And Charlie said, "A country without economists, what a wonderful place it must be." At any rate, after a couple of years, I was placed in charge. I became the desk officer. On the day that I arrived on duty, the people who were in contact with Henry Kissinger told me that he had just come back from Tehran, where he had met with the Shah. The Shah said, "These ignorant mullahs are simply not capable of leading these demonstrations against me. Someone else must be organizing them, directing them." The Shah said, "I asked myself who this could be, and there's only one answer I can provide. The CIA is doing this. And why would they do this to me?" He said, the Shah said, "I have two answers, but I can't decide which is right. One answer is that the Americans want to divide Iran as the British did back in the early 20th century between themselves and the Russians. The Russians will take the northern part of the country, the Americans will take the south." That's one possible explanation. The other is that the Americans, in their intense anti-communism, don't think I am a sufficiently strong leader to oppose Moscow. They think that if a religious leadership was substituted, there would be a much stronger anti-communist regime. And my reaction was, this man we have entrusted to protect our interests in the Middle East, and he's a nut. We shall see more of that later on. At any rate, things went from not so bad to much, much worse by the end of August, which was the end of Ramadan. And then on September the 8th, I believe it was, there was a shoot-up in Jolly Square. A lot of people were killed. The regime said maybe 58 people were killed. The opposition thought hundreds were killed. I was taking a shower the next morning, do some of my best thinking while underwater, and I decided that there was no way that the Shah, who was at war with his own people, was going to prevail in that war, and that we were going to see a new Iran with new leadership. I didn't know when, I didn't know what shape, but I thought we ought to begin to adjust ourselves to a different kind of Iran. That meant getting to know the opposition to the Shah and getting them to know us, and putting a little daylight between ourselves and the Shah's regime. Well, I couldn't go into work the next day and say, "I've had a brilliant insight, and it is this," because I would soon be studying Mongolian or on my way to West Africa. But I did have, very soon, a couple of days after, I had a requirement to meet. Camp David was going on, the big Israel, Egypt, the US meeting under Jimmy Carter's chairmanship. They decided that they would call the Shah to buck him up. After all, this Jolly Square massacre had shaken him. He was already shaking, but he was shaken even more. So Hal Saunders, my boss, who was at Camp David, said, "What should we say to the Shah to buck him up a little bit?" Well, here was the test. Did I really believe what I had determined in the shower? Was I really going to tell the truth? What do you think? Knowing perhaps very few Foreign Service officers, you might think I would speak candidly. No, that's not the way it is. But I devised an artful message of 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph would say, naturally, we support His Imperial Majesty and his efforts to bring stability and restore progress and order to Iran. Paragraph 1. Paragraph 2. And we support his move towards liberalization of the Iranian political system. That's the first paragraph for the Shah, the second paragraph for the opposition. They see, that's the way the State Department is, a little bit juggling 2 things at the same time. Didn't work though. The Shah liked it. So he published the message, and his opposition condemned us. So we lost another one. Anyway, things went from bad to worse during the fall. Gary Sick was my counterpart in the White House. We were required to work together in order to start off towards some effective policy. I must say that I think my big mouth, as you've heard today so far, made it very difficult for me to get along with him. I offended him mightily, and pretty soon he stopped talking to me. He stopped calling me up and saying, how should we react to this? What should we do about that? I think so-and-so, you think so-and-so. Those discussions ended. You can't run a policy when 2 working level stiffs can't talk to each other. So if you ask me what I did wrong during the revolution, I would say there's one example. I mean, we're now in the Obama era, right? So we were free to admit error whenever it occurs. All right. Now, anyway, things went bumpy downhill all the way. During this period, Dr. Brzezinski and Gary Sick argued for the application of an iron fist. That is, the Shah should crack down, kill as many people as necessary, clean the streets of these demonstrators so that he could start over again. I argued that that wouldn't work. I had worked with the Iranian military during my stay in Iran. I didn't think they were up to the job. Not because they weren't, but the people at the top, the generals at the top, were recruited by the Shah on one principle: loyalty. That was their primary virtue as far as he was concerned. They weren't creative, for the most part, they weren't creative activists. They were loyal supporters. Down below, you have people, soldiers manning the barricades, who are the exact same as the people assaulting the barricades. They are religious. They are not going to be able to shoot down their brothers, so to speak, for very long. I didn't think it would work. Anyway, then we came to the revolution, as I mentioned, Dr. Brzezinski. The whole fabric of American policy collapsed. A meeting was held in the White House. I wasn't present. I used to go to those meetings, but Dr. Brzezinski got fed up with me. Anyway, I wasn't present. But the decision made by President Carter was that we would try to build a new relationship with Iran. New government, we would try to start over again with a new kind of relationship. What I think people in Washington didn't realize, is that there was one of the primary reasons for the revolution, which, by the way, we didn't call it a revolution until it was virtually over. One of the primary reasons for the revolution was to get the United States out of Iran, remove the puppeteer. Everything that we did was deemed to be designed to influence Iran. That's what led to the hostage crisis, because we couldn't convince anyone of our goodwill and our willingness to start over again. We accept the revolution, all of these things, we would say that we weren't believed. And so, that suspicion, that unwillingness to accept on trust doomed us from the very start. Now, let me talk a little bit quickly about leadership of the Iranian side during and after the revolution. I think our great flaw in dealing with Iran during the days of the Shah was that we confused him with Iran. We didn't pay any attention to, then I guess, 45 million Iranians. All we were concerned about was one man. This one man was the only thing. He didn't want us to talk to the opposition. We didn't talk to the opposition. He was willing to accept Richard Helms, who was the CIA chief as ambassador. Iranians thought that was a terrible appointment. The CIA had overthrown Mossadegh. We didn't pay any attention to the Iranian people as a whole. We paid only attention to the Shah. And when it came to a war between Iran and Iranian people and the Shah, we ended up on the wrong side. Now the Shah was I was in meetings with him 4 or 5 times during my time in Tehran. He was a highly intelligent man with a vast sum of knowledge about the world, except his own world. Every time I would take a group of visitors to see him, there would inevitably be a question, what about your opposition? And he would say, a mere annoyance. They count for nothing. They are not going to slow us down. He understood the world perfectly, but not the world of his own country. And he didn't have advisors who would tell him anything differently. He had advisors who would say, yes, your Majesty. Now, because we were so closely tied to him, it became a very difficult matter to disassociate ourselves with him. It wasn't just Iran, it was the neighboring countries, particularly the Gulf Arab states. What would they think if we dumped the Shah, if we removed him from office? I think that sensitivity tended to inhibit policy. In the event, however, though, I don't think it amounted to very much. Now, once the Shah had gone and Khomeini had taken control, we kept on with the same kind of mistake. We confused Khomeini for the Iranian people. Iran, for us, didn't count. Khomeini was what counted. We have this way of personalizing our policy, and the same thing has happened now. Ahmadinejad is regarded with abhorrence by people. He becomes the symbol of our policy, the direction of our policy, and the Iranian people, we tend not to pay any attention to. Khomeini was badly understood. No American was able to meet with him. We weren't able to talk to him at all, in part because we refused and then the Iranians refused. But it's clear that he had one set of advisors when he was in Paris who put out a line that he was a great liberalizing force, and then he had another set of advisors when he got to Tehran and clerics took over control of his access to information. Now, let me ask, we are in the question period, but I'll ask one question. Would it have made any difference if we had come to the view that the Shah was not going to survive? Could we have corrected our policy of the past 30 years, 25 years? When could we have done that with any effect? I've tried to to deal with this question, I don't think there was a moment when we could have changed sides, so to speak, or when we could have modulated an American policy.
Unless you asked that question in 72, not 79.
Perhaps in 72. An Iranian friend of mine said, I asked him, he was one of the regime supporters, I said, ostensibly one of the regime supporters, I said, when did you know that the Shah was not going to survive? He said, in 1953, the day after the coup. Okay. Leaving that aside, when could it have happened? Might have happened in 1972. But there was no trouble in 1972. I mean, there were riots in universities and there were assassinations of Americans, but there was no reason to say to the Shah, particularly by Richard Nixon, you better shape up and change your policy. Even Jimmy Carter, when he came into office, remember the speech, Iran is an island of stability? Even Jimmy Carter wouldn't press to change him. Why not? Because he had bigger fish to tend to. He was dealing with the Arab-Israel crisis, he was dealing with the Soviet Union and China, Panama Canal. All he wanted to do with Iran was let it keep quiet, let it not appear on the front page of the papers. So I don't think there was a moment when we could have prevailed on the Shah to change his way of life. And I don't think there's a moment when we could have prevailed on Khomeini to compromise with the Shah. I don't think the two of them, that there was any place in between where they could have met. I think once we entered into this process of the revolution, we simply had to go its full length. All right, I'm going to yield now. But I would urge you to bear in mind, as you think about present American policy and the direction of what we're doing with Iran, those four issues: ignorance, ideology, inertia, and insults. Those four things keep in mind. And you might add another I, and that is Israel. But we can come back to that later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Henry, for the insight that you cannot find anywhere else, quite honestly. There are several publications about this whole period that we are dealing with today. And one of them is All Fall Down by Gary Sick, that I recommend if you are interested in learning about those era. If you find it, it's out of print. And then the other one by Robert Heiser is Mission to Tehran. He had a very, I guess, detailed memoir of those days. And in my opinion, very sophisticated and informative. I did not know much of the problems with the Iranian military before I read this. One of the issues was, for example, General Reuter was sent to Tehran to try to keep the military intact and working together. And once he got there, he realized that none of the three branches of military are meeting together. So he was able to bring the three commanders of Army, Air Force, Navy, and the Defense Secretary, General Tufanian, in one room. And it says this is the first time they met together, because they always met with Shah one-on-one, because he did not trust them to be together and the fear of possible coup. So with that in mind, really, a lot of problems that happen later can be seen in detail and how it happened. So these two, and then I also recommend a book by Nikki Kelly. It's called Roots of Revolution. If you are a student here and you want to read about the causes of the revolution, she had done a great work in defining the issue of that year. Now coming to today, the present, and the future. We heard about the history of the Islamic Revolution. Now we want to know, well, what happened during the past 30 years and what is going to happen in the next cycle of this dilemma. And the first thing that comes to mind is the nuclear issue. And nuclear issue is, in I guess everybody's opinion, is not the question of the right to enrichment or to right to have the technology or energy. It has turned into a political issue. And I would say the Westerners very bluntly admit that for them it's not about the non-proliferation treaty. It's about who can have it and who cannot. So it's about the question of Ahmadinejad or the question of Islamic Republic. It's not about the right of this or right of that. But somebody who had done a lot of research and studied this, both by profession and by interest, is Professor Saimi, who is our second guest today. And he's a professor of chemical engineering at USC, and also he chairs an endowment of National Iranian Oil Company that was established actually before the Islamic Revolution by Shah and used to be called Shahanshah Ariamer's chair of petroleum engineering. And that was another ironic thing that he was telling me this morning that, well, 30 some years ago, when he was a student, he was a staunch opposition activist against the Shah, and now he chairs the endowment that he established. So with all of those, I would like to invite Dr. Saimi to share some thought with us. But before we go there, I also want to do a plug about our dinner reception. We still do have some tickets, but we need to know exactly the count. So if you are planning to attend the dinner, I ask you to, right after the Dr. Saimi's talk, go back there and we have these $20 tickets for Middle East dinner. It's a reception. Unfortunately, Dr. Saimi will not be there, but Mr. Pratt is there, and we are honored to have him. And so the reception is in his honor. It's not the celebration of Islamic Republic. Dr. Saimi.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. This is my first trip to beautiful Portland. And as Henry said, what a wasteful life before coming here. As I was coming this morning, I was flying from Los Angeles to Portland. I was thinking that 31 years ago, when I first moved to the United States and the Iranian Revolution was going on, I was reading about Henry Precht in the newspaper. And I remember I was saying, if I could get my hands on this Henry Precht. Well, it took me 31 years to get my hands on him. But before I start saying a few words about Iran's nuclear program, I would like to present to Henry my answer to his question. In 1964, the United States demanded the Shah to give legal protection to American military advisors to Iran. That led to riots against the Shah's government and the exile of Ayatollah Khomeini. That was the first sign that Iranian pride and nationalism is not going to accept whatever the United States was going to dictate to Iranians. In 1974, the Shah stopped all pretense of political polarity in Iran, dissolved all political parties, and established a sort of quasi-fascist party called the Rastakhi's Party. That was another sign that the Shah's regime, supported by the United States, was not going to last. So if the State Department had your wisdom at that time, maybe this could have been prevented, or maybe it could have been redirected to another path. But let us not talk about the thorniest issue between Iran and the United States, or more precisely, between Iran and some Western countries, and that is Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program, as presented in the West, is nothing but a collection of lies, exaggerations, innuendos, and just without any substance propaganda. Iran's nuclear program was actually started by the Shah. In a secret letter that Henry Kissinger sent to the Shah through Richard Helms, the United States ambassador to Iran, in April of 1974, he suggested to the Shah that Iran and the United States establish a bilateral commission to look at how to expand collaboration and cooperation between Iran and the United States, and in order to do that, form several committees. And he suggested that priority to be given a commission on how to expand nuclear cooperation between Iran and the United States. And then in 1976, the Ford administration suggested to the Shah that in return for buying 8 nuclear reactors from the United States, the Ford administration was willing to give Iran, or to establish for Iran, a nuclear fuel reprocessing center in Iran that would reprocess the nuclear waste from nuclear reactors to generate new fuels, and also uranium enrichment technology. The same problem that the United States is opposing today. So it wasn't that the United States did not want Iran to have a nuclear program, it was that they didn't want to give it to anybody that they don't trust, okay? The Shah was their ally. They had put the Shah in power in 1953, and they viewed him as sort of a police of the Persian Gulf, and they were willing to give him anything he wanted, according to the Nixon doctrines, according to which the United States was going to help local powers to protect the United States' interests around the world. And in fact, in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution was victorious and overthrew the Shah, one of the first acts of the revolutionary government of Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan was to cancel all of Iran's agreement with the United States and the rest of Western world about establishing and constructing nuclear reactors in Iran. And in fact, I was one of the victims of that cancellation in the following sense. When I came to the United States in 1978, I came here to get my doctorate degree in chemical engineering with a scholarship from Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, to go back to Iran and work for Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. When I started my studies at the University of Minnesota in fall of 1978, Iranian Revolution was in full force. I did not receive a penny as part of my scholarship from Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. A few months after the revolution, in June of 1979, I went back to Tehran and said, what happened to my scholarship? And I was told, you don't owe us anything, we don't owe you anything. We canceled all contracts, we don't need you anymore. So you see, the revolutionary government actually canceled all of Iran's nuclear agreement with the Western powers. But then in 1983, Iran decided to restart the program, probably partly as a result of Iran-Iraq war and the fact that Western powers were helping Iraq to fight Iran. So what Iran did was, in full transparency, Iran approached International Atomic Energy Agency in 1983 and asked them to send a team of experts to Iran to study the possibility of establishing a uranium enrichment facility in Tehran under inspection and monitoring and safeguarding by the agency. The agency sent a team to Tehran, and they studied it, and then went back to the agency in 1984 and submitted the report according to which the agency was supposed to train Iranian scientists in order to start the uranium enrichment program. But who stopped it? The United States. If at that time that program had been started under supervision and monitoring of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United States and other Western powers would have had direct access, monitoring, and control on the program, and perhaps we would not have been here today talking about it. But the United States refused to do it, and it did not allow agency to go ahead with its plans. Iran approached Argentina, Brazil, Czechoslovakia, Russia, and several other countries in order to get that technology. Letting the International Atomic Energy Agency know what they were doing. At every step, Iran was stopped from doing it. So what did Iran conclude? Iran concluded that it was not going to be able to set up a uranium enrichment facility in Iran under the supervision of International Atomic Energy Agency because the United States would oppose it. So what did they do? They start doing it in secret. However, there is a great misperception here about the secrecy of the program. Yes, Iran started the program to build the uranium enrichment facility in late 1980s, but it was not illegal because Iran's only obligation to its safeguard agreements that it had signed with the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1974 was to inform the agency the existence of any nuclear facility only 180 days prior to introducing nuclear material into that facility. In other words, a country can build as many nuclear facilities as they want. The only obligation that they have, legal obligation under international law, is to let the agency know that those facilities exist 180 days or 6 months before introducing nuclear materials into those facilities. And Iran actually did that. President Mohammad Khatami in February 2003 announced officially that there is a nuclear enrichment facility in Iran under construction, and Iran was going to start introducing nuclear material into that facility in about 6 to 8 months. The IAEA visited Iran in February of 2003, and sure enough, Iran started bringing nuclear material into the facility in 2003, in summer of 2003. So Iran did not violate any of its obligation under international laws and under its safeguard agreements that it had signed with the agency in 1974. So that's a misperception that it is repeated again and again and again that Iran had an 18-year secret, illegal or illicit nuclear program. No, Iran didn't have it. Iran actually wanted to have that facility in full transparency and under the supervision of International Atomic Energy Agency. It was the United States that prevented it. Then Iran signed an agreement with 3 European countries, France, Germany, and Britain, in October of 2003. According to this agreement, Iran was going to submit to additional inspection and tougher monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which in the jargon of the agency is called the additional protocol. Iran was going to submit to that even before that agreement was ratified by the Iranian parliament. This was called the Saadabad Agreement after the name for Iran's presidential palace. And Iran is starting to carry out those obligations on voluntary basis because it had not been ratified by the Iranian parliament. The next year in Paris, in November of 2004, Iran signed the Paris Agreement, according to which Iran reaffirmed its intention to carry out the provision of additional protocol even before Iranian parliament ratified the agreement. In return, the European countries were supposed to suggest to Iran a comprehensive program that would address the West's concerns about the nature of Iran's nuclear program in return for substantial help to Iran in terms of technology, in terms of nuclear technology, aviation, and security. Then what happened was in August 2005, the European Union submitted its proposal to Iran. A European diplomat called it a beautiful box of chocolate, which is, however, empty. It had a nice packaging, but there was nothing in it. What the European Union wanted was for Iran to give up all the advances that it had made on its own in return for some vague promises for the future. For example, when it came to security, the European Union promised that they will not attack Iran with nuclear weapons. First of all, attacking a country with nuclear weapons is against United Nations charters. Second, Iraq wasn't also attacked by nuclear weapons. It was invaded illegally by conventional forces. So that meant nothing as far as security of Iran was concerned. So what happened? Iran withdrew from the agreement, and in February of 2006, Iran announced that it was going to go ahead with its enrichment program. Since then, Iran's nuclear program has been under a strict monitoring and inspection of International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, last week, there was this report, the latest report by the agency about Iran's program, in which it said that Iran now has about 1,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. Low-enriched uranium is a material that people use in nuclear reactors in order to generate electricity. Now, low-enriched uranium can be converted to high-enriched uranium in order to make a bomb. But the process of going from low-enriched uranium to high-enriched uranium is a very complicated process. It cannot be done unless Iran announces or declares its intention to leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, expel the International Atomic Energy Agency monitors from Iran, and take the nuclear material to some sort of secret facility in order to enrich it to high levels so that it can make the bomb. But not only that, it also has to reconstruct the enrichment facility from ground zero, because the facility that you use for low-enriched uranium cannot be used for high-enriched uranium. You have to repipe and rewire and do a lot of things. And that will take at least a year. But last week, after the International Atomic Energy Agency released its latest report, there was much hype and much speculation that how close Iran was to making a nuclear bomb. Iran is not close. It got to the point that the agency had to issue, in a very unusual move, had to issue a clarification about this report, saying that Iran is not close, Iran hasn't violated any of its agreement, and so on. Now, Iran's nuclear dossier has been sent to the United Nations Security Council, and the Security Council has issued 4 resolutions against Iran, through which it has imposed some sanctions. In the opinion of people like me, as well as many legal scholars, sending Iran's nuclear dossier to the United Nations Security Council has been totally illegal, against International Atomic Energy Agency statute, against Iran's safeguard agreements with the agency, and against Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'll just tell you briefly why. When Iran announced that it was withdrawing from its agreement with the European countries and will start its uranium enrichment activity, the Board of Governors of the agency ordered Iran to stop it. But the Board of Governors, and neither the agency, has any legal authority to do it. There is not a single word in the statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency that gives it the power to demand a member state to stop its legal, under inspection, uranium enrichment program. There is not a single word that it can do it. Then when Iran refused to do it, the agency, the Board of Governors, referred Iran's nuclear dossier to the United Nations Security Council. That was the second violation, because Article 12C of agency statute specifically mentions the conditions under which a member state should be referred to United Nations Security Council. It says that if a member state has diverted nuclear material from peaceful purposes to non-peaceful purposes, and that is discovered, then that member state nuclear dossier should be referred to United Nations Security Council. There has never been a diversion of nuclear material in Iran from peaceful to non-peaceful purposes. The latest IAEA report that was released last week, as well as all the previous reports, confirm and reaffirm that there has never been any diversion. That is the only condition under which a member state can be referred to United Nations Security Council. Therefore, sending Iran's nuclear dossier to the United Nations Security Council was totally illegal. Now, when it comes before the United Nations Security Council, all the 4 resolutions that have been issued against Iran are also illegal. Why? Because those resolutions have been filed under Chapter 7 of United Nations Charter. Chapter 7 of United Nations Charter deals with peace and security at the international level. Article 39 of United Nations Charter specifies that if a resolution is going to be filed under Chapter 7, the United Nations Security Council is obligated to first specify the threat that that member state poses to the international security and then issue its resolution. The 4 resolutions that have been issued against Iran do not mention any threat. They only refer to what the IAEA has done. But what IAEA has done is totally illegal, and therefore the resolutions have no legal basis. Just to give you an example about the bias against Iran in this case, let me give you this example. In 1967, there was a big war between Israel and Arab countries. And then in 1973, we had another war. As a result of those 2 wars, there are 2 resolutions against Israel. Resolution 242 and Resolution 338. Both resolutions order Israel to evacuate occupied territories. But those resolutions were not filed under Chapter 7, which deals with peace and international security issue. In other words, 2 wars in the Middle East that are the root cause of the instability in the Middle East are not considered threat to international peace, but Iran's peaceful nuclear program, which is under full supervision and monitoring and inspection of International Atomic Energy Agency, is considered a threat against peace and security at the international level. That is just a bias against Iran. I don't care whether one is a fan of President Ahmadinejad or a fan of the opposition or anything like that. Dr. Eghtedari mentioned several of his friends were executed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. My own brother was executed by Islamic Republic of Iran. He was 23 years old. My 3 cousins were executed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. They were between 19 and 28. Numerous of my classmates from my old college years were executed by Islamic Republic of Iran. But this is not about Islamic Republic of Iran, in my opinion. This is about the legal rights as well as obligation of a member of international community that has abided by its obligations under international laws and therefore is entitled to the rights and benefits that those international laws entitle that nation. Therefore, most, if not all, what we hear about Iran's nuclear energy program is nothing but lies, exaggerations, baseless accusations, innuendos, and devoid of substance propaganda. Now, does that mean that Iran is totally innocent here? No, of course not. When a head of a state, like President Ahmadinejad, uses his rhetoric against Israel, or denies Holocaust, or has a conference in Tehran about Holocaust, of course, that creates an atmosphere at the international level to use that and to mask Iran's legal rights in order to prevent Iran from getting access to what is legally its right. So, to summarize, I say once again, most of what we hear about Iran's nuclear program is lies, exaggeration, baseless accusations, and innuendos. Now, does that mean that we cannot solve this problem? Yes, we can solve this problem. We can only solve this problem and we can only address this issue when there is mutual respect and trust between Iran and the United States. It is, of course, very, very difficult to have trust between two nations that have been such arch foes for over 30 years. But we can start from respect and build towards trust. Mr. Henry Craig is known as somebody who lost Iran. Even he told me that he sometimes introduces himself as, I'm Henry Craig who lost Iran. Now, we don't lose anything unless we own it. The United States did not own Iran to lose it. Iran is a country with 4,000 years of written history. Iran has made glorious contribution to humanity, to civilization. And Iran is a fiercely nationalist and proud country. Or we hear that the approach to Iran must be a stick and carrot. Well, a donkey is treated with a stick and carrot. Not a powerful nation in one of the most strategic areas of the world with dynamic population, young, educated population, natural resources, and strategic positions. So we can move towards trust if we start from mutual respect. The problem between Iran and the United States will not be solved unless the United States start treating Iran as an equal partner with respect that it deserves as an old nation, as a powerful nation, and as a nation.
Thank you, Dr. Saimi. As I mentioned prior to this talk, the issue of nuclear energy in Iran is not really the matter of legal rights. It's a political issue, and it's very, very complicated, in fact. And he alluded to rhetoric by the Iranian president that makes the case even worse. But this is where we are. And so if we want to move forward, then, as he said, we need to really start with trust. And there is a hope. There is a hope. Actually, my friend Trita Parsi, who was supposed to attend, has this sentence that says, the new president, President Obama, less than 20 minutes in his inauguration speech, talked about mutual respect with Iran, something that in the past 30 years was missing from the dialogue. So let's have the hope on that statement.